Okay, so it's saying we're live, but it takes a minute. So Paul, send a message when we're live on the outside of YouTube. Okay. Do you remember Kermit Schaefer's bloopers ads, Jacob?
I don't think so.
It was like a collection of old TV and radio things where, hot mic situations where like some children's show, host would be like, that would keep the little bastards happy, and it was a record you would buy. It was always on like Channel 11 or, or Channel 5 for sale on like local TV channels.
I don't think so. I feel like the name Kermit would have stuck in my mind.
Yeah, it was like bleeps, bloopers, and something. Yeah, but this is the perfect opportunity for that.
I'll do my best.
Yeah.
Just checking to make sure the dogs are not out.
All right. Yeah. Who let them out?
Well, the last interview I did, our big dog was barking continuously to be let in at the door, and I decided it would be more disruptive to get up and open the door than it was to just let her bark.
Yeah, that's not good. Okay, we're live, and you know what? We are live, but I can't see your messages, Producer Paul, but hopefully we'll see them at some point. This is the Reason Interview with Nick Gillespie, where I go deep with the artists, entrepreneurs, thinkers, and oddballs who are making the 21st century more libertarian, or at least more interesting by challenging old, worn-out ideas and orthodoxies. My guest today is Jacob Sullum. I'm not sure, Jacob, where you fit into that. Maybe you're an oddball or an artist or a thinker, or maybe all three. Not really an entrepreneur, but he's a Reason senior editor, syndicated columnist, and he's author of the great new book, Beyond Control, Drug Prohibition, Gun Regulation, and the Search for Sensible Alternatives. Jacob, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for inviting me. I want to point out that according to Jake Tapper, I'm not just a thinker, but one of the country's most original thinkers.
There you go. Very nice to hear.
It has to be true because it's on the front cover of my book.
Yes, that's excellent. And we're going to talk about the book, which looks at the similarities between century-old efforts to control guns on the one hand and drugs on the other. And we're going to take some questions from the internet, hopefully. But before we get to the book itself, Jacob, I want to ask you about some breaking news that's relevant to the themes that you are discussing in the book. There are reports today, whatever today is, Thursday, and I'm looking at my calendar, Thursday, September 4th. Pam Bondi, world's greatest attorney general, is floating the idea of banning gun rights for transgender people because of the recent church shooting in Minneapolis, which was carried out apparently by a transgender woman who killed 2 kids, injured 21, and then shot herself as well. I want to ask 2 questions about this. The first is there really anything that can be done to stop these kinds of mass shootings at schools or churches that we're not doing now?
I mean, there are simple things. In some of these cases, basic precautions were not taken, such as locking doors. That happened with the school shooting in Texas, just letting people wander in. But in broader terms, you have a fundamental challenge where there are lots of oddballs in the country, lots of troubled, angry people, and virtually none of them will ever commit a crime like this. So if you're trying to identify ahead of time who is going to actually commit one of these crimes, it's not something judges can do. It's not something legislators can do, or bureaucrats or mental health professionals. If you cast the net wide enough, in the hope that you'll catch the would-be mass murderers, you're inevitably going to catch many more innocent people who would never harm anyone. So that's the fundamental challenge. So in terms of screening people or using red flag laws or trying to disarm people ahead of time, you have that fundamental challenge.
Do you, is there a cost benefit analysis, or what is the cost benefit analysis of saying, like, okay, red flag laws, which allow people to kind of, and law enforcement and other kind of authorities to say this person represents a prospective threat to the community and to themselves. So we're just going to take their guns away for a certain period of time that might be renewable, et cetera. Is there a cost benefit analysis of saying, okay, yeah, we're going to do that, and we know we are going to actually infringe on the rights of lots of people, but it is worth it in order to prevent something like the Minneapolis school shooting?
Well, there's really no evidence that red flag laws prevent mass shootings or violence generally. The stronger evidence has to do with preventing suicide. Even that is iffy. But taking it at face value, the estimates that researchers have proposed suggest that something like 9 out of 10 or more of the people who are disarmed would never have committed suicide. In other words, you're not preventing a suicide. And the advocates of these laws would argue it's still worth it because we think we are preventing at least a few suicides, which, it's possible. So that's a serious question. That involves value judgments. It's not just a question of, numbers.
Right.
When you have the vast majority of people who are losing their Second Amendment rights are either not threats to themselves or not threats to other people, I think that's really fundamentally problematic. So you can ask, do we compare that to the standards you apply to a criminal conviction where, you want proof beyond a reasonable doubt? It's a much stronger standard than is applied either in the civil context where you're, say, hospitalizing people, mental health facilities, or in the context of red flag laws. It's a much lower threshold. So I don't think there's any definitive answer to that, except that we have to concede that it's not just an issue of the numbers, it's an issue of the value judgments. What value do you attach to Second Amendment rights? And what value do you attach to a prevented suicide, for example? Which
are the majority of gun deaths in a given year are suicides, right?
Right. Most gun deaths are suicides, and furthermore, the evidence on red flag laws suggests that in most jurisdictions, the typical use is to prevent people from harming themselves, not to prevent them from harming others. It varies, somewhat from one jurisdiction to another, but overall, that's the basic picture. So it's sort of misleading when politicians say, "Oh, this is the solution to mass shootings," when in fact, what ends up happening is you're trying to stop people from hurting themselves.
Are there any trends in mass shootings? And I mean, you and I have worked together for 30 years, right? And we've both written, more than me, and certainly more authoritative than me, have commented on a lot of mass shootings, as well as also mass shootings that have been foiled by people who are armed and stop something. But is there a trend in, or what are the trends in mass shootings over, say the past 25 years, as well as gun crime, including, homicides, but also, just armed robbery and things like that?
Well, I mean, mass shootings are a very tiny percentage of total firearm homicides. People tend not to realize that because they attract a lot of attention because they're scary, they're spectacular, but the vast majority of homicides committed with guns are run-of-the-mill crimes, gang shootings, or robberies, or other kinds of violent crimes where you're not, somebody's not randomly targeting innocent people in a public place.
Right.
But of course, the latter sort of crime, obviously tends to attract more attention. It goes up and down. The numbers are highly volatile because it's such a rare crime. Recently, in the last year or two, they seem to be becoming less common. But it's very hard to say when you're trying to measure the impact of, say, the assault weapon ban, federal assault weapon ban, or things like red flag laws, because this is such a rare crime, it's very hard to come up with any kind of persuasive numbers one way or the other. Is this having an impact?
What about gun crime in general? Over the in the 21st century, is gun crime less common now than it was 25 years ago?
Well, it's certainly less common than it was in the early 90s. I mean, we've seen a big decrease in homicides over that period. There was the surge, during the pandemic, but now we seem to be returning to the previous trend, and the numbers are quite low historically. And people don't realize, I mean, when you and I were growing up, violent crime was much more common.
Yeah.
We were allowed to wander the neighborhood all day long and report back for dinner. That was very common at the time, even though objectively speaking, the threat of crime was much higher then. So people's perceptions don't necessarily correspond to the reality.
The second question that I wanted to, that leads directly into a discussion of your book, which looks at the ways in which both guns and drugs, there are always attempts to take rights to guns or to using certain types of drugs away from people, often based on kind of group characteristics or membership in some kind of outgroup, often racial groups, but also sometimes, it could be youth, or it could be, kids who are, people who dress a certain way and are presumed to be in gangs and things like that. But when Pam Bondi, the Attorney General of the United States, says, we should take gun rights away from trans people, is this a good idea, or is this part of is it with continuity in kind of the discussion of the attempts to disarm people, certain populations, that your book, that's been going on for literally centuries in America and the colonies that preceded it? Is this just more of the same, that type of rhetoric?
Well, it's completely absurd, I would say. First of all, there's no legal basis for it. Under current federal law, people who have been involuntarily committed to a mental health facility lose their Second Amendment rights permanently. And that in itself is highly questionable, because say you're suicidal, or say people just think you're suicidal, and that's how you end up being committed. Decades later, even if you ever were a threat to yourself, and you're no longer a threat to yourself, you're still not allowed to own a gun. That makes no sense. You don't even have to be deemed a threat to other people, right? So even if you're treated because people think you're suicidal, you lose your gun rights. But even that is a stricter standard than what Bondi is talking about, saying, people who we think are mentally, I think the argument is that if you're transgender, you're by definition mentally ill. That's what they're implying. But there are millions of people all across the country who have various psychiatric diagnoses. That is not a sufficient basis to lose your Second Amendment rights. You would not qualify under federal law unless there's a court order that forced you into treatment. So I don't think there's any way they could possibly do this in terms of statutory law. And it would certainly be inconsistent with the Second Amendment. But it does reflect the general sort of thinking that if we can identify a group where we think the risk of violence is higher than for the general population, whether or not we're right, we're going to say those people can't own guns. So that was certainly the argument about, if you've been committed, then you can never own a gun. But also, if you're a drug user, you can't own a gun. If you are ever committed of a crime that's punishable by more than a year of incarceration, you can never own a gun again. And that, covers lots of people with no history of violence.
So those like embezzlers, the famously known for gunplay, right? They're out. You mentioned in the book, that Donald Trump is barred from gun ownership because he's, he's a felon, right?
Yeah. So whatever you think of Trump, and I'm not a fan. To say that these paperwork violations, where the essence of those felonies was that he tried to cover up reimbursements for hush money by misdescribing the reimbursement as payment for legal services. That's the thrust of it. There are 34 felonies because there are 34 examples of paperwork. Whatever you think of that case, and I think the case was bullshit. It was a bullshit case, unlike some of the other cases against him. But even if you think that was a valid prosecution, how is it logical that sort of crime would make you think someone's prone to violence? Furthermore, how is it logical that the president of the United States, who controls the U.S. military and our nuclear weapons, is not allowed to possess a handgun?
Yeah,
right. It's just totally absurd.
Like handgun, nuclear bombs.
It's right. So you run into situations like that, but the premise there, with all of these different categories of people who are what they call disqualified or prohibited persons, right? The categories of prohibited persons are based on the premise that people in those groups are especially dangerous. Doesn't mean that all the members are dangerous. It just means that on average, those people are more dangerous, which may be true or may not be true, but it means you're totally, you're judging people based on group membership and without any regard to their actual histories or whether they've ever shown any sign of being violent.
To drive that home, I mean, you talk about how in the origins of gun control, the racist roots of gun control in America, really, you talk about how in the in slave owning states and particularly in the South, just as a matter of course, in most of these states, blacks, whether they were free or slaves, were banned from owning weapons. What were the arguments that were put forward to say, okay, we're preemptively, saying this class of people can't own guns legally?
Well, I mean, white people in slave-owning colonies and states were terrified of slave insurrections, for good reason. If you enslave people, you better.
It's hard to sleep at night.
An eye out for resistance.
Yeah.
And so this is not a matter of speculation or inferences. Very explicitly, the early gun control laws in what became the United States and then in the United States were aimed at disarming black people, not just slaves, but also free black people, because they were seen as possibly more threatening because they were not supervised. And they might help slaves who wanted to rebel, and they also were examples of freedom that might encourage rebellions. So in some cases, the restrictions on free black people were actually more severe than the restrictions on slaves, because slaves you might want your slave to carry a gun for hunting or for other purposes, as long as it was authorized by his purported
master owner.
That was okay. Right. So that's very clearly that's the origin of gun control in the United States, had to do with maintaining white supremacy, keeping black people in their place.
And then, I mean, of course, that similar logic gets applied to later ethnic groups. I mean, you talk about how in New York State, laws that were passed for gun control legislation, I guess, starting around the turn into the 20th century, identified Italians as particular problems. I'm half Italian, so I always am particularly interested in, my people being designated as incapable of rational thought or of impulse control. Can you talk a little bit about how, the similar arguments that were used to disarm blacks started getting ported over to talk about, disfavored ethnic groups?
Yeah, well, so what happened is, after the Civil War, you have the 14th Amendment. So now laws are not supposed to explicitly discriminate against particular racial or ethnic groups. That's unconstitutional.
Right.
So you have laws that on their face are neutral, but then they can still be used to target particular groups.
Yeah.
So in the case of black people, if you have licensing laws, either licenses to own or licenses to carry, they would be discretionary licenses. So it's up to local officials to decide do you deserve to own or carry a gun? On its face, that's neutral, but in practice, it meant that white people could continue to disarm black people, even at a time, or maybe especially at a time when they faced horrific racist violence.
Yeah.
This is a way of preventing them from resisting that violence. And by the same token, you have these facially neutral laws that are targeted at, in practice, other ethnic groups. So you mentioned Italians. So the Sullum law in New York, which is the ancestor of the law that the Supreme Court overturned a few years ago, it established this discretionary standard where you don't have a right, you have a privilege that can be awarded or rescinded by the government. And the motivation of the Sullum law was very strongly influenced by this fear of Italian immigrants,
right,
who were presumed to be criminals, presumed to not be able to, that they would, how they are. They can't control their impulses, and they always carry weapons, and they will get.
They have vendettas. I mean, like they're very emotional people, and they talk with their hands. And if there's a gun or a knife in their hand, somebody's going to get hurt. I particularly enjoyed reading that part because Sullivan is obviously a cartoonishly Irish name, and I'm half Irish, so I felt like, this explains my parents' marriage very well. That one was trying to disarm the other, but it didn't work very well.
Let me just illustrate that point a little bit. There was a raid in Buffalo, several years before the Sullivan law was passed, where they rounded up all the Italians. Well, all of like the young Italian men, I guess, the people who looked like they might be carrying weapons. That's right. You could tell just by looking at them, and they searched all of them, and it was a pitiful sort of. I think they found a few knives and maybe one gun.
So it worked. It worked, right?
Well, but it just illustrates. I mean, obviously, it shows how Fourth Amendment protections have evolved over time, because you obviously can't get away with doing that sort of thing nowadays. And there was a similar raid in San Francisco, in Chinatown,
right,
where the city said you have to have a license to carry a weapon, and this wasn't just guns; this was weapons in general. There were certain exceptions if you had permission from the local police, or if you were a traveler. So you're not a resident, but you're passing through town, and it was presumed that you needed a weapon for self-protection. But otherwise, you needed special permission, and there was an assumption that Chinese immigrants, first of all, they don't know what the law is,
right?
So of course they're not going to obey it, whether they're inclined to or not. They don't even know what it is because they're so ignorant. And there also was an assumption that they tended to be criminals and tended to be armed and violent. And so there was a raid in Chinatown where they raided, I think it was 3 different Chinese theaters where they did perform Chinese opera. And again, lined everybody up, searched every single person. And they didn't find anything on the people they searched, but they found, like, under the seats in the theater, some just discarded, metal bars and I think a few knives. I don't remember if they actually found any guns in that case, but it was a pretty pitiful haul given the number of people that they searched. Right. So, but again, it's just an example of that law was not explicitly anti-Chinese, but in the enforcement of it, it predictably, especially
it was targeted for this. And actually bringing in the Chinese is a good way of talking about the origins of drug laws as well, because you talk about how, particularly on the West Coast and in California, laws about opium smoking and intoxicants or drugs that Chinese communities use, those were singled out. And they have a similar kind of origin story, right? Of there's a racial or ethnic group that we are uncomfortable with, and they do, and we're going to make it harder for them to get on with their lives. Can you talk about how the opium, how kind of anxiety about Chinese opium use helped create the early anti-drug laws in America as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to note that the same police captain in San Francisco who carried out the raids that I just described,
Mm-hmm.
was also led the first raid on an opium den in San Francisco. And so that's sort of part of an overall pattern. And so the basic question when it comes to the drug laws that states began to pass in the late 19th century and then the federal government later passed in the 20th century
Mm-hmm.
is how did these substances, which for many years were readily available to anybody who wanted them, over the counter, through the mail, without any kind of prescription, and it was not seen as necessarily disreputable or dangerous or threatening.
Mm-hmm.
How did those same drugs come to be the objects of so much fear that ultimately, the government decided that they needed to be banned?
Yeah.
And so this is not the complete explanation, but definitely a big part of the explanation is that certain drug habits came to be identified with specific despised minority groups.
Yeah.
So in the case of the opium den ban in San Francisco, which is the first anti-drug law, if you don't count the alcohol bans
right.
that states passed in the 19th century, all of the rhetoric surrounding that had to do with these horrible Chinese people who were simultaneously portrayed as incredibly industrious and clever and really good at making money, to the point where they were an economic threat to native-born people, but also lazy people who would just smoke opium and sit in dens all day and not accomplish anything. All of the rhetoric surrounding that habit had to do with the association with Chinese immigrants who were hated because of the economic competition, really mainly.
Right.
And the anti-opium laws were just part of a general policy of harassing Chinese immigrants to the furthest extent possible,
right.
so as to discourage them from coming, to maybe get them to leave. And this is, again, not a matter of like you have to speculate or infer. This is what people explicitly said.
Yeah, that's
we don't want them anymore.
Yeah.
And look at their horrible habits. And one of those horrible habits was smoking opium.
Have you ever smoked opium, by the way?
I have not tried it.
No. I have to, this is part of the problem with prohibition, right? Is that in describing the torpor or the dangers of a drug, it puts ideas in your mind, like, oh, that sounds kind of interesting. I don't know.
It does, and apparently it smells pretty good too. But
there's perfumes called opium, right? I can't smell bad, right?
So opium smoking was bad. First of all, it was an illustration of the decadence and depravity of Chinese people. But then also there was a fear that this habit will be passed on to the white majority.
Right.
And so again and again, you see politicians and journalists saying, these dens don't just have Chinese people. They have white people, white women.
And they have white women. Yeah, is like, oh my God.
Or even people of various races mixing together, which was horrifying.
Yeah, that's never good, right? Is part of it is the American dream, but then it's a nightmare when it's happening in your hometown or something. Yeah.
So very clearly, these early anti-opium laws were explicitly motivated by that fear that this foreign dangerous habit was going to be introduced to the majority and ruin the country.
Yeah.
So you can say, well, some sort of contrarian historians say, well, they really were concerned about protecting white people. That was their main motivation. But it's very hard to separate that concern from the fear of foreigners, because it was the fact that it was perceived as a foreign and alien habit that made it especially scary.
Right, and then you talk about how that gets. The same kind of gesture or logic is behind identifying cocaine as a black drug, and cocaine Negroes in the early 20th century. The New York Times would write about, and Mexicans and marijuana, right? This is the basic script, is that you identify a particular intoxicant as the whatever. Is heavily used by a particular outgroup. You demonize them, the outgroup, and the substance.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at opium, the first ban, it did not apply in San Francisco. It did not apply to morphine.
Yeah.
It did not apply to orally consumed opiates, which were, through the 19th century and into the early 20th century, you could buy without a prescription because that was portrayed as medical use, and that was okay. Yep. And more to the point, this is what proper white people did. It was not what the Chinese people were doing. And so that distinction is very clear early on. Then eventually it became that all opiates had to be strictly regulated. And with cocaine, same thing. That was available over the counter in patent medicines. But especially in the South, when it came to be identified with Black people, and it was purported to make them uppity, rebellious, violent, drive them to rape white women, give them superhuman strength, so that ordinary police guns were not enough to stop them. They needed higher caliber weapons in order to deal with these cocainized Negroes. And you can argue about the extent to which those ideas influenced the broader prohibition movement, but very clearly, at least in southern states, it coincided with moves toward restrictions. And it was explicitly about keeping Black people in their place. I mean, these are the terms in which it was phrased. When people were concerned about cocainized Negroes, it was not mainly, we feel bad for them because they have this difficult drug habit. It was they're a threat to us. And a similar thing happened with marijuana, where you could get cannabis for oral consumption, right, over the counter for years and years, and it suddenly, once it became a habit of smoking marijuana that was associated with Mexicans, it became much more terrifying. And again, this varies from one jurisdiction to another, but definitely in the Southwest, in Texas, in Arizona, in New Mexico. You see all of this lurid coverage of Mexicans becoming violent when they use marijuana around the same time that the early laws are passed. So it's not like the whole explanation for these laws, but it clearly played a big role in at least some places.
And you can, I mean, just as you're explaining this stuff, you hear the echoes of this, are still with us today, of that, and even if it gets detached from racial or ethnic groups, but people who take a certain drug have superhuman strength, and that's why cops need bazookas in order to kill drug-crazed fiends and all that. One of the things where you talk about, and I want to get to the point of drug prohibition and gun control are on kind of parallel tracks, but they intersect at various points, particularly in federal legislation. And part of the point of your book is that people who, at least in contemporary politics, people who tend to want to legalize drugs want to ban guns, and people who want to ban drugs oftentimes want to, make guns more available. So it's a weird thing, and you've kind of written the perfect book to always be alienating half of your readership, right? So I commend you for that intellectual, clarity, at the cost of people wanting to be like, okay, I'm comfortable with this. Like, you're forcing all of us to think hard about this. But you talk about how the Marijuana Tax Act and the Harrison Narcotics Act, these were early federal drug laws that prohibited a lot of stuff or regulated a lot of stuff. One of the things you point out is that these were explicitly framed as revenue generators or revenue acts. They were not saying, okay, we're banning this stuff because it's evil and it's bad, but they believe that, but they put it in terms of, taxes. Can you talk a little bit about where that logic comes from?
Yeah, I mean, at the time, even the politicians who wanted to crack down on drugs or guns took it for granted the federal government had no authority to do that directly. So you
which is amazing, right? Like this, because these are police powers or something that are relegated to the states in the Constitution. And you talk about a Congressman, Joseph W. Bailey, who was a Democrat from Texas, who was like, we don't have the right to do this kind of stuff. Right. But so the taxing is the way around that.
Right. So even Harry Anslinger, who is a very famous anti-marijuana demagogue who headed the Federal Bureau of Narcotics for many years, he initially did not favor a federal ban and explained they have no authority to do that because this is a drug that's grown mainly within the states where it's consumed. There's no interstate commerce. The federal government has no authority to simply ban these things. And eventually he got on board. He later said, because he was getting all these complaints from police in the West and in the Southwest about what happened to Mexicans when they started smoking marijuana, and they were demanding federal action. So he eventually got on board. But even then, it was framed as the Marijuana Tax Act. It was ostensibly about taxing these transactions and then requiring registration, then punishing people if they didn't meet those. If they didn't register, they didn't pay the taxes, then they could be punished. That was the crime.
Right.
And you see the same thing with early gun legislation at the federal level. The Attorney General at the time explicitly explained when they passed the first federal gun control law in 1934, he said, obviously we don't have police powers. We're not the states. We can't just go into, a city or a state and try to attack crime. That's not our job.
Right.
Maybe Donald Trump might want to take note of that point.
Yeah.
But if we can find one of the enumerated powers that arguably relates to this, then we can invoke that. So initially, gun control at the federal level was again about taxing certain products, making people register so that the tax could be imposed, and then punishing people for failing to register or failing to pay the tax. Right. And then only later did these laws get to the point where they said, well, you know what? Actually, we're regulating interstate commerce. That makes it okay. Yeah. And then that logic was extended, thanks to the Supreme Court, to the point where you don't even need interstate commerce that you're regulating. You can say this gun has either traveled in interstate commerce, which is going to be true, for most guns, unless it's made in the state where you happen to live, or even more commodiously, it affects interstate commerce.
Right.
Right. So that's just equivalent to giving the federal government a general police power, because you're saying anytime you can allege that something affects interstate commerce, now Congress can pass legislation to address it. And so you have, in both cases with drugs and guns, and a revolution in the understanding of the federal government's proper role.
Right. And that came to the fore in the 2005 Supreme Court ruling in the Raich case about medical marijuana in California, right? Where the medical marijuana that was being grown for Raich and Monson and the defendants in that case was completely homegrown. It never left the state. It had no effect on interstate commerce, but it was ruled that, well, kind of it does, right? Or conceivably it does.
Well, it was not commerce, because it was, in one case, one of the plaintiffs grew her own. In the other case, she had friends who did it for her. Yeah. It was not sold, so it was never commerce, and it was not interstate because it never left the state. So what possible argument can you have that this can be reached by the federal government's power to regulate interstate commerce? And the majority's argument was, well, Congress established this scheme for regulating these drugs under the Controlled Substances Act, which itself relied on this much broader understanding of the Commerce Clause. And once it's established this scheme, we don't want to allow any kind of conduct that might undermine that scheme. And so, yes, these two patients, they're not selling anything. It's not leaving the state. But in the same way that violating the production quotas for wheat. This is the case back in the 1940s. Clashed with Congress's scheme for regulating the prices of agricultural commodities, even if the extra wheat was consumed entirely on the farm of the guy who produced it.
Right.
In that same way, if you let people grow their own marijuana, it's going to have an effect on the general commerce in marijuana. Some of it might be diverted into interstate commerce, but in any case, by the same logic that was applied in the wheat case, which came out of the New Deal, we can also outright prohibit possession. This marijuana that was grown in this woman's home that she keeps in her dresser drawer is somehow an issue for the federal government. And so when the Supreme Court reached that conclusion, Clarence Thomas was utterly appalled. Not most people's idea of it. He's not most people's idea.
He's not a swinging.
No.
And Sandra Day O'Connor also. That was either her last or one of her last cases, right? That she sat in on. She was also deeply bothered by the logic of the majority in that case.
Yeah. So, but Thomas's point was, if Congress can regulate this under the Commerce Clause, it can regulate anything. Which means it's no longer a government of enumerated powers. It's a national government that can do whatever it wants on whatever subject it decides to focus on. And so that's the point. The point is that even though conservatives may not be too keen on drugs and might even generally support the war on drugs, it leads to results like that where you totally undermine the system of federalism that was created by the Constitution, where powers are divided between the states and the federal government, and there's certain things that the federal government can't do simply because it's not authorized to do them.
Let's talk a bit about how things change, because one of the most interesting developments really over, the past 30 years or so in America is both drugs, illegal drugs, certainly marijuana, and guns are more available legally, or at least semi-legally in the case of drugs. They're legal at the state level, if not quite at the federal level. Things are better than they were. It is easier, and there's lots of caveats here and qualifications, but it's easier to buy a gun and carry it in more circumstances than it was 30 years ago. It is easier to buy and sell drugs legally, or in a gray market as opposed to simply a black market than it was. Let's talk about how things change. And one of the unlikely kind of heroes and villains of your book is Joe Biden, who everybody is like, he's like a character in a sitcom that was brought in towards the end of the run and nobody liked, and we're trying to forget that he was ever in Happy Days or something like that. But he was a drug warrior. He was a gun control warrior. Never really changed his tune on guns at all, but he did on drugs. Like, can you use him to explain, like, how did so many drug warriors, we'll start with them, how did they come to a point where they're like, oh, you know what, actually a lot of the drug laws that we passed aren't working, and we should change them?
Yeah, well, I would point out, first of all, that Joe Biden actually did change his tune on gun control, because back in the 80s, he was saying, I'm not a believer in gun control. I think criminals aren't going to follow the law, and it makes no sense to burden, law-abiding gun owners with all of these rules and restrictions. That was his basic position. It was a sort of middle-of-the-road position. And then he later, embraced pretty much every.
Thank you. I stand corrected. So he's the perfect example of a guy who went from being okay on guns to being terrible, and then from being terrible on drugs to being like at least contrite about some of his actions.
Not quite so terrible. I mean, if you take him at his word, he had no idea about, back in the 80s, that when he was supporting all of these draconian penalties, that it would hurt a lot of black people, which, the crack penalties in particular, overwhelmingly impacted black federal defendants as opposed to white or Hispanic defendants. And that he saw the error of his ways eventually, that they were drawing an arbitrary distinction between smoked cocaine and snorted cocaine that didn't really make sense scientifically. He thought that's what the experts were saying at the time. So either he misunderstood them or the experts were wrong or whatever. But basically, this has to do with the realization that starting with black politicians, actually, because black politicians initially supported those laws. They thought this would help their communities. And in fact, it ended up hurting their communities. And pretty quickly, by the early 1990s, they had come around and they saw who were the people who were doing, serving these mandatory minimums. And they're overwhelmingly black. And this doesn't seem to be helping drug problems, but it's definitely hurting these people, their families, their communities. So they came around, well before Joe Biden did, but eventually he heard that message. So in terms of crack penalties in particular, but also mandatory minimums in general, which he now supposedly rejects, by the time of his 2020 campaign, he was saying they should be repealed. He was the guy who, helped get all that stuff on the books.
Yeah.
And used to
bragged about it. Yeah. He wouldn't shut up about being hard on crime.
His thing was, Republicans say Democrats are soft on crime. It's not true. Look at all of these wonderful mandatory minimums and death penalties that we support. And so he came around, and I think some of it was probably sincere, like some of it was genuine regret. Some of it was a political calculation because as opinion within the Democratic Party evolved to sort of turn against at least some aspects of the war on drugs, I think he sort of felt constrained to change his thinking. So it's a combination of those things.
What was the role of?
But he still, sorry.
No,
I mean,
sorry.
he still could not bring himself to support repealing, the federal marijuana ban.
Right.
He was still talking about, I think this might be a gateway to other more dangerous drugs, and we need to look into that. They've been researching that issue for decades. It's never going to be definitively resolved just because of the methodological problems. But this is the same theory that Harry Anslinger was pushing, years and years ago, that after he went from saying, marijuana makes you murder people, the new argument became, well, marijuana might not be so bad in itself, but it leads to heroin.
Yeah. And then you kill people. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, as Joe Biden is still talking that way. So
and he moved to reschedule marijuana, but there was no follow through, right?
Well, there was a little bit of follow through. I mean, there was a rule that was proposed.
Right.
It was a rule that was proposed actually by the Justice Department, which is interesting because the Drug Enforcement Agency administration ordinarily would do that, but they were not on board with it, even in the Biden administration. Yeah. And basically the effects, assuming that's ever actually done, and Trump, by the way, says he supports that change, moving it from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2.
If only he knew somebody in the DEA or the Department of Justice who could,
could
push it. Yeah.
But even, all right, so let's assume that's done. The effects are quite limited.
Right.
The biggest boon from this is that state licensed marijuana businesses will be able to deduct business expenses when they file their federal income taxes. It's a huge burden for them because under current law, because it's a Schedule 1 drug, and they're still distributing it illegally under federal law, they cannot deduct standard business expenses, so rent and salaries and all that stuff.
Right.
They actually can deduct the cost of the marijuana itself, which is kind of counterintuitive, just because of what the tax courts have decided, because that the cost of goods sold is distinct. If you've done your taxes, you might recognize this distinction. Cost of goods sold is different from ordinary business expenses, whatever. So that it'll lift that burden, because once it's no longer a Schedule 1 or 2 drug, it doesn't trigger that tax disability. And then the second thing is that it will make medical research somewhat easier, because there are extra requirements that are attached to a Schedule 1 drug that you don't have with a Schedule 3 drug. And so it's plausible that it would encourage more research on marijuana's, potential medical benefits.
So
And
just
that's basically it. I mean, it would still be a federal. All these businesses still be engaging in federal felonies. The penalties might be somewhat less severe. They would still be subject to prosecution, still be subject to imprisonment, civil forfeiture, all of that, as well as anybody who contracts with them. Or the only thing protecting all of those people at this point is the Justice Department's decision to exercise its enforcement discretion. Which can change at any time.
Let's talk about, are you worried the movement to legalize drugs at the federal level, and it seems like politicians, particularly national politicians in Congress or in the White House, will be the last ones. Like they will sign off on something that is already kind of a de facto reality. It seems to be the case. Do you worry at all that the states are going to start backsliding on drug legalization? Because after a couple of decades of success, it seems like energy and momentum for legalizing more drugs might be the momentum might be stalling out.
Look, marijuana was a relatively easy sell because this is a drug that at this point most people born after World War II have some experience with it. They've used it themselves. They know people who have, didn't ruin their lives typically. And so they perceive that it's not such a big deal, or they may actually like it themselves.
Right.
So that was a much easier sell as opposed to, say, heroin, which is much less commonly used and seems much scarier. Psychedelics are an interesting example because they're not that commonly used, compared to marijuana. Certainly they're not.
Yeah.
But you do see state level reform when it comes to psychedelics, starting with the idea that helped propel the marijuana reform movement, which is there are medical uses for this drug. And I wouldn't call them medical uses. They're, psychotherapeutic uses, psychological,
Right.
I mean, but uses basically that people in authority are willing to recognize as serious.
Yeah.
Like this will help you either with a problem for which you were able to get a psychiatric diagnosis,
right,
or to help develop your spiritual development, which is also a serious thing.
Yeah.
And so you start to see, in some cases, outright legalization. A couple of cases in Colorado and Oregon of certain psychedelics. And encouragingly, in Oregon, in neither Oregon nor Colorado do they require a prescription or a doctor's recommendation or any particular kind of diagnosis. So
and they seem to be comfortable with plant-based psychedelics, which is also, they're hard to regulate really or restrict because people can kind of grow them. Yeah,
well, you've got psychedelic mushrooms popping up all over the place.
Yeah.
And the idea that you're going to control
you open a closet and there's a grow bag full of mushrooms. I don't know how it got there, but there it is.
Not even that. I mean, it depends on the climate, but you might have them popping up on your property and you don't even know about them. Once you know about them and you know what they can do, then you could be criminally liable.
That's right.
Same with opium poppies.
We only have a couple minutes left, but if I can just jump to guns. One of the things that happened there was, there were a number of, states began to liberalize their gun control laws. And I guess this was mostly because more conservative or, pro Second Amendment legislatures were elected and they liberalized gun laws. And then that started moving up to the federal level where there have been a couple of Supreme Court cases that have been, very favorable to gun rights. Do you think there are going to be any reversals of that? Because, as we started out talking, the Trump administration in its first term after the Las Vegas shooting, it restricted bump stocks. It is talking about restricting the rights of transgender people. Red flag laws are proliferating at the state level and whatnot. Do you think gun laws or gun rights and gun availability is going to continue to expand?
I don't see much backsliding there. I mean, this is actually when in my chapter about the impact of the war on drugs and gun control and civil liberties, the one real bright spot is the Second Amendment. That it is because of a series of decisions from the Supreme Court, it is now increasingly respected. Lots of gun laws that people took for granted are now vulnerable. And one example, which is encouraging in terms of sort of cross-partisan alliances, is the ban on gun possession by illegal drug users, which applies, to millions of cannabis consumers across the country, even if they live in states that have legalized marijuana.
Right.
And this is something that people on, both Republicans and Democrats, not all of them, but you see people in both parties saying that's crazy.
Yeah.
Like your state allows you to use this either for medical use or recreational use, yet somehow if you do that, you don't have your Second Amendment rights anymore. The Biden administration, very enthusiastically, zealously defended that law. Same law, by the way, that the president's son violated.
Right.
Which he didn't think his son should go to prison for that. And fortunately, Hunter had a father in the White House.
Yeah.
But people do go to prison for that sort of thing. It's a very tiny percentage of the people who could potentially be prosecuted. But the unlucky bastard who gets caught with a joint and a gun, even if he's not combining those two things, in other words, even if he's not handling a gun when he's high, he can go to prison for 3 or 4 years. Right. So I think you have Ron DeSantis in Florida, who is nobody's idea of, an enlightened thinker when it comes to drugs, saying that doesn't make sense. You had the Democrat who was in charge of the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services there, who filed a lawsuit challenging that law as applied to Florida medical marijuana patients, who is his political opponent. She filed that lawsuit. He agreed with her position. And on the campaign trail, he says it doesn't make any sense that you could lose a constitutional right for using a product that's legal under state law.
Yeah.
So you're starting to see conservatives and progressives agreeing on that issue, which is encouraging to me because I think they can start to see that they do actually share some common ground, that they're identifying a lot of the same issues when they talk about either the war on drugs or gun control.
Okay, I think that's a good note to end on. The book is Beyond Control: Drug Prohibition, Gun Regulation, and the Search for Sensible Alternatives. You can find all of Jacob's work at reason.com. Look for his name. Jacob, if anybody is going to bring the, anti-gun people who are pro-drug legalization and the anti-drug legalization who are pro-gun rights together, I think it's obviously going to be you, and the book does a fantastic job of doing that. Thank you so much for talking to the Reason interview today.
Thank you.
All right.